everyone, this is going to be chapter 3 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. If you haven't seen all the previous videos, that's totally fine. If there's anything that needs an explanation or references a prior chapter, I will let you know. This is also one of those videos you can just turn on and do something else, you can do your chores, drive, what have you, because there's nothing going on the screen. Rarely we do get some kind of image or diagram. In that case, I'll just explain it, not a big deal. So we get sort of a notification before chapter 3 starts saying that chapters 3 through 7 will cover, and then there's this section, part 3, that it points to out of this 12-point list, which actually comes from either chapter 1 or the introduction. And so the section that is highlighted here is part 3. It is true that the theistic God exists. This is evidenced by the A, beginning of the universe, cosmological argument, B, design of the universe, teleological argument or anthropic principle, C, design of life, teleological argument, and D, moral law, moral argument. Right away, I'm really not excited. Let me tell you, I'm reading this book for you guys. If it was just me, I probably would have stopped reading it definitely by the end of this chapter 2. This is a difficult book to read because it seems like it's supposed to be for atheists, and very rarely we get a glimpse that the authors actually understand what atheists are concerned with and what they really believe, and then they just go back to throwing us in the typical apologetics that seems like it's something made for Christians to feel better about their belief, and it doesn't actually address what atheists actually believe. The title of chapter 3 is In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge, and surge is in all caps. We get a quote from Albert Einstein: "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." Hopefully this is explained later on. I really am getting sick of all these quotes. It seems like an excessive use of quotes in this book. This section here is titled Irritating Facts with Irritating in quotation marks. It was 1916, and Albert Einstein didn't like where his calculations were leading him. If his theory of general relativity was true, it meant that the universe was not eternal, but had a beginning. Einstein's calculations indeed were revealing a definite beginning to all time, all matter, and all space. This flew in the face of his belief that the universe was static and eternal. Einstein later called his discovery, quote, irritating, end quote. He wanted the universe to be self-existent, not relying on any outside cause, but the universe appeared to be one giant effect. In fact, Einstein so disliked the implication of general relativity, a theory that is now proven accurate to 5 decimal places, that he introduced the cosmological constant, which some have since called the, quote, fudge factor, end quote, into his equations in order to show that the universe is static to avoid an absolute beginning. Now, I do worry where the authors are going to go with this one. If I put on my hat from all those many years ago as a Christian, I'm going to guess that it's something along the lines of even when non-believers want to avoid the reality of God, they're still faced with the facts that the stuff in the Bible is true. That's where I think they're going to go with this. If you have any predictions, feel free to pause the video, type it out, and post a comment. Thanks. But Einstein's fudge factor didn't fudge for long. In 1919, British cosmologist Arthur Eddington conducted an experiment during a solar eclipse which confirmed that general relativity was indeed true. The universe wasn't static, but had a beginning. Like Einstein, Eddington wasn't happy with the implications. He later wrote, "Philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole." I do kind of like that they're including this because it does show the honesty that scientists and mathematicians are displaying. That even though they don't want something to be true or they don't like how something feels, they're still just going where the facts lead. Of course, this might open up the author's idea that they really believe, if you haven't seen the other videos, they actually believe that atheists are atheists not because we're unconvinced, but because we just personally don't like the idea of a God to be held accountable to. So hopefully this doesn't go there, but you never know. But By 1922, Russian mathematician Alexander Friedman had officially exposed Einstein's fudge factor as an algebraic error. Incredibly, in his quest to avoid a beginning, the great Einstein had divided by zero, something even school children know is a no-no. Meanwhile, Dutch astronomer Willem de Sitter had found that general relativity required the universe to be expanding. And in 1927, the expanding of the universe was actually observed by astronomer Edwin Hubble, namesake of the Space Telescope. Looking through the 100-inch telescope at California's Mount Wilson Observatory, Hubble discovered a red shift in the light from every observable galaxy, which meant that those galaxies were moving away from us. In other words, general relativity was again confirmed. The universe appears to be expanding from a single point in the distant past. I really hope that they are not trying to set up this idea that we should follow the science because, look, here it proves that there was a beginning, therefore it proves Genesis, which of course it wouldn't. But then the problem is that this type of Christian, or Muslims as well, they'll use science and then they'll ignore science. So this science is okay because it lines up with what I believe, but this other science is not okay, or it's just a theory. They'll accept general relativity as a theory here and what a theory means in science, and they'll accept that. But then they'll demote it to the everyday English use of the word theory, like an educated guess. They'll demote it to that when it comes to something like the theory of evolution. In 1929, Einstein made a pilgrimage to Mount Wilson to look through Hubble's telescope for himself. What he saw was irrefutable. The observational evidence showed that the universe was indeed expanding, as general relativity had predicted. With his cosmological constant now completely crushed by the weight of evidence against it, Einstein could no longer support his wish for an eternal universe. He subsequently described the cosmological constant as, quote, the greatest blunder of my life, end quote, and he redirected his efforts to find the box top of the puzzle of life. This is a reference to something I believe it's from the introduction, where they're saying that we're trying to kind of figure out life, and our pieces of evidence are like pieces of a puzzle, and that something like the Bible is that box top for the puzzle that gives us the image for us to follow. So we're supposed to put those pieces of our life in the image of the picture on the box top. Einstein said he wanted to know how God created the world. I am not interested in this or that phenomenon in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thought. The rest are details. Although Einstein said that he believed in a pantheistic God, or a God that is the universe, his comments admitting creation and divine thought better describe a theistic God. Okay, so here again we're getting this idea that, well, yeah, they said one thing, but actually what they really mean is this. And as irritating as it might be, his theory of general relativity stands today as one of the strongest lines of evidence for a theistic God. Indeed, general relativity supports what is one of the oldest formal arguments of the existence of a theistic God, the cosmological argument. All right, so I guess we're getting run through this. So if you guys don't know the cosmological argument, here we are. The cosmological argument, the beginning of the end for atheism. It's a big, big statement. Don't be put off by the technical sounding name. Cosmological comes from the Greek cosmos, which means world or universe. That is, the cosmological argument is the argument from the beginning of the universe. If the universe had a beginning, then the universe had a cause. In logical form, the argument goes like this. Number one, everything that had a beginning had a cause. Number two, the universe had a beginning. Number three, therefore, the universe had a cause. As we showed in the last chapter, for an argument to be true, it has to be logically valid and its premises must be true. This is a valid argument, but are the premises true? Let's take a look at the premises. Premise 1. Everything that had a beginning has a cause is the law of causality, which is the fundamental principle of science. Without the law of causality, science is impossible. In fact, Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, said, "True knowledge is knowledge by causes." In other words, science is a search for causes. That's what scientists do. They try to discover what caused what. I'm not really a big fan of how this is worded. The idea of the law of causality, this is more of a philosophical idea than it is something that the scientific method tries to find. In the sense of causes, when we're looking at the scientific method, we're trying to figure out what is the cause of some other thing. but it doesn't say like that everything that comes to exist must have a cause as a fundamental principle. I guess you can assume that if you're trying to assume that this cause could be found, like you're investigating something because you assume that there's a cause for this reaction or consequence. But in terms of how it's presented here, it almost seems like how people talk about the law of attraction. This idea that because we call it a law and people know what it means, it's a fundamentally intrinsic part of science. And I don't know if I necessarily would agree with this here. I do agree that science is a search for causes, but I don't believe that this idea of the law of causality is that everything that came into existence must have a cause. And I'm not disagreeing with that necessarily, I'm just not a big fan of how this was worded. The law of causality is something that's, I would say, is closer to ideas in philosophy. And we can argue that philosophy is the foundation of science, and that's fine, but this seems like they're trying to really connect it to something we would consider more like the scientific method. I agree that science is the search for causes, but I don't agree that without the law of causality, science is impossible. The law of causality, as they're presenting it here, is that everything has a cause. So in this, specifically, they're saying everything that had a beginning had a cause, because this way we avoid having to explain the cause of Yahweh, or the Christian God, or Judeo-Christian God, because this idea that everything has a cause, well then what's the cause of God? Well, he doesn't have it. He's an uncaused cause. And so they just say, well, everything that has a beginning. So this is sort of a modified version of this argument to avoid having to explain the cause of Yahweh. But I don't think that science is impossible. We can still look for something that X causes Y without granting that everything that had a beginning had a cause. I don't think we need to start with that, especially as it pertains to the beginning of the universe. I don't think we need to start with that to use the scientific method to determine what is causing some other thing. So I would agree that science is a search for causes, but I don't think that without the law of causality, science is impossible, what they're explaining here. So I feel like they are misrepresenting it a little bit, but what do you guys think? If there's one thing we've observed about the universe, it's that things don't happen without a cause. When a man is driving down the street, a car never appears in front of his car out of nowhere, with no driver or no cause. We know many a police officer has heard this, but it's not true. There's always a driver or some other cause behind that car appearing. Even the great skeptic David Hume would not deny the law of causality. He wrote, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition, as that something could arise without a cause." Now, I would agree with David Hume in the sense that it's always the Christians who are claiming that atheists are asserting that things came out of nothing. So instead of actually discussing what atheists feel or believe or are concerned with, we get told a lot, this is what you believe, and it's stupid. So there's a lot of straw man arguments that happen, which unfortunately I feel is kind of where this book keeps returning to. In fact, to deny the law of causality is to deny rationality. The very process of rational thinking requires us to put together thoughts, the causes that result in conclusions, the effects. So if anyone ever tells you he doesn't believe in the law of causality, simply ask that person, what caused you to come to that conclusion? Now, this is just a play on words, but the authors are really big on this, and they call this the roadrunner tactic, where they think they really hit a home run in terms of crushing an argument simply by playing a couple word games. And if that's where you have to resort, you're not having an honest discussion. If you're going to sit here and twist words around and try to get a gotcha moment out of it, you're just doing this to pat yourself on the back. You're doing this for your own ego. You're not doing this because you actually want to have a discussion. So if somebody ever tells you they don't believe in the law of causality, ask them to explain what they think the law of causality is and why they don't believe it. That's probably a better line of discussion. Since the law of causality is so well established and undeniable, premise 1 is true. Let's just go with that. Okay. I wasn't saying the law of causality doesn't exist, just saying that I don't think that it's fair to say science is impossible if we don't come to the same conclusion, or that we have to think about everything that had a beginning had a cause, in this cosmological sense. So what about premise 2? Did the universe have a beginning? If not, then no cause was needed. If so, then the universe must have had a cause. Until about the time of Einstein, atheists could comfort themselves with the belief that the universe was eternal and thus did not need a cause. There's that kind of phrasing again, just like, oh, these stupid atheists, they're lying to themselves, they could comfort themselves. But since then, 5 lines of scientific evidence have been discovered that prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the universe did indeed have a beginning. And that beginning is what the scientists now call the Big Bang. The Big Bang could easily be remembered by the acronym SURGE. Okay, well that's where the all caps is from. In the beginning, there was a great surge. Every several years or so, the major news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and the like, run a cover story about the origin and fate of the universe. When did the universe begin, and when will it end, are 2 of the questions investigated by such articles. The fact that the universe had a beginning and will ultimately die is not even up for debate in these reports. Why? Because modern scientists know that a beginning and an ending are demanded by one of the most validated laws in all of nature, the second law of thermodynamics. S. The second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is the S in our SURGE acronym. Thermodynamics is the study of matter and energy, and the second law states, among other things, that the universe is running out of usable energy. With each passing moment, the amount of usable energy in the universe grows smaller, leading scientists to the obvious conclusion that one day all the energy will be gone and the universe will die. Like a running car, the universe will ultimately run out of gas. Now this, of course, assumes that the universe is a closed system. Even under the Christian worldview, Yahweh interferes with the system from outside of the system, so I don't know how fair it would be to include this from a Christian perspective. You say, so what? How does that prove the universe had a beginning? Well, look at it this way. The first law of thermodynamics states that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. In other words, the universe only has a finite amount of energy, much as your car only has a finite amount of gas. Now, if your car only has a finite amount of gas, the first law, and whenever it's running it continually consumes gas, the second law, would your car be running right now if you had started it up an infinitely long time ago? No, of course not. It would be out of gas by now. In the same way, the universe would be out of energy by now if it had been running from all eternity. But here we are, the lights are still on, so the universe must have begun sometime in the finite past. That is, the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. Well, I'm still going to say, so what? You still have to prove the beginning is God. A flashlight is another way to think of the universe. If you leave a flashlight on overnight, what's the intensity of the light in the morning? It's dim because the batteries have used up most of their energy. Well, the universe is like a dying flashlight. It has only so much energy left to consume. But since the universe still has some battery life left, it's not quite dead yet, it can't be eternal. It must have had a beginning, for if it were eternal, the battery would have died down by now. This is another thing I really don't like about this book, because instead of actually addressing what we're here to address about faith being an atheist and how we're going to get closer to us saying that the only reasonable answer, the most likely answer that we can pretty much agree on as the start of the universe, that's God. Instead of talking about that, they're going on about the universe having a beginning as if they have to prove that to us. I don't think anybody reading this is under the impression that, no, wait a minute, the universe is infinite. I mean, we started off with this whole explanation of how in the early 20th century, the scientists, mathematicians, cosmologists, etc., they are going through a period of growth, learning that the universe had a beginning. We don't need the authors to try to explain to us that the universe had a beginning. I don't see what this section is for. This is one of those things that if a student wrote it, I would say, why do we have all of this? You've already established this in the first 2 pages. Why are we spending another 2 pages trying to establish this? You've already established it. This just seems like you're filling up time or space. The second law is also known as the law of entropy, which is a fancy way of saying that nature tends to bring things to disorder. Now, let's just make a prediction here. I'm going to predict that when they talk about disorder, they're going to use something like chaos, they're going to use something like a broken or like a rusted item, or a room that keeps getting more and more messy, or something along those lines. Maybe something that was like a rusted out item, like a rusted bicycle or something that was left to slowly degrade over thousands of years or something along those lines. So let's see what they say. That is, with time, things naturally fall apart. Your car falls apart. Your house falls apart. Your body falls apart. In fact, the second law is the reason many of us get dresser disease when we get older. Our chest falls into our drawers. Ha ha ha. Now, I don't know if... I don't know. Is that what the second law covers? Does the second law apply to this joke? But if the universe is becoming less ordered, then where did the original order come from? Astronomer Robert Jastrow likens the universe to a wound-up clock. If a wind-up clock is running down, then someone must have wound it up. The second aspect of the second law, or this aspect of the second law, also tells us that the universe had a beginning. We still have some order left, just like we still have some usable energy left. The universe cannot be eternal, because if it were, it would have reached complete disorder or entropy by now. A number of years ago, a student from a Christian ministry on an Ivy League campus invited me, Norm, to speak there on a related topic. This is another thing I really don't like about these authors. A student from a Christian ministry on an Ivy League campus. They're not explaining where this happened, when this happened, etc. They just want us to believe this is a totally true thing. During the lecture, I basically told the students what we've written here, but in a lot more detail. After the lecture, the student who had invited me there asked me to have lunch with him and his physics professor. Always having lunch with these guys. Last time they had lunch with an atheist who's just so angry and scrawling all over his napkin at lunch, talking to Ravi Zacharias, you know. It just seems very... I just may be a simple country lawyer, you know, that's just kind of how it comes across, that we're supposed to accept that it's true because it seems homey and relatable, but he's sitting here quoting other people from other books. Some of the books are quite old, but he still tries to pull them up and cite them, he being Norm, or, you know, also Frank. But then when it comes to stuff that maybe we would actually want to check it, to verify whether any of this even happened, it's all a person, this one time, a professor on a campus somewhere, just go with it. As we sat down to eat, the professor made it clear that he was skeptical of my argument that the second law requires a beginning for the universe. In fact, he said he was a materialist who believed that only material exists, and that it has existed for all eternity. So what? Who cares about this guy? You better have some really good explanation here. Because again, what's the real thing that we actually care about as atheists? Why do you believe that a God was the cause of the universe? That's what I care about. I don't care about you having this, you know, down-home country style cooking, and you had this poor boy here who didn't understand, you know, his butt from a hole in the ground. I don't care about this story time. I care about what you can demonstrate. And we're what, 5 pages in, and we still haven't gotten any closer to trying to establish that there's a God behind any of this. That's what's so frustrating about this book. It's just, hey, let's tease you with something you might be interested in learning, and then throughout most of the chapter, we're gonna go off on a tangent, and then promise you that in the next chapter, I super promise we're totally gonna talk about it. Every time we're having the same problem. If matter is eternal, what do you do with the second law? I asked him. He replied, every law has an exception. This is my exception. Wow. This sounds wholly made up. Wow. Okay. A student from a Christian ministry on an Ivy League campus invited me, and after the lecture, the student who had invited me there. Okay, so we're talking about a Christian ministry student on an Ivy League campus is just, I mean, why should we care what he has to say? I get that maybe we should care what Einstein might have to say about something like general relativity, sure. Why do we care about this discussion you're having with some ministry student on an Ivy League campus a number of years ago? Why should we care about this? This better be good, Norm. This better be good. This better be worth our time. I could have countered him by asking if it's really good science to assume that every law has an exception. That doesn't seem very scientific, and maybe even self-defeating. It may be self-defeating when you ask, does the law, every law has an exception, have an exception? Norm, this is, oh. I mean, the bad part is, it's like he's so desperately trying to get us to this, like, gotcha moment that he, again, ignores what's actually being said. If it does, maybe the second law is the exception to the law that every law must have an exception. Oh, man. Oh, man. I didn't go down that road because I thought he would have taken exception. Okay, you got me there, Norm. You got me there. Instead, I backed off the second law for a moment and decided to question him about materialism. If everything is material, I asked, then what is a scientific theory? After all, the theory about everything being material isn't material. It's not made out of molecules. Without a moment's hesitation, he quipped, a theory is magic. A theory... Norm, you don't have to cite a conversation with every moron you speak with. Just get to the point. This is so frustrating. Why are we wasting our time with this? Obviously, this person is not very intelligent, if this person even exists. But again, this just seems like it seems very convenient that, golly, those fake Christians on those Ivy League campuses, they really think that they have everything figured out. But as soon as you ask them, you can see their whole worldview just collapses into nonsense and make-believe. I mean, this fits right in with that. So not only do I not believe this happened, but I question if it was created even in good faith as an illustrative purpose, as opposed to just trying to make fun of people they consider atheists. Remember, this is a Christian ministry student, but this type of Christian, as we've seen in previous parts of the book, this type of Christian believes that other Christians aren't Christian because they're not the right Christian. Just like Bible-believing, church-attending Christians are not Christian because they're not the right type of Christian. So as far as we're concerned, this Christian ministry student on an Ivy League campus is a stand-in for an atheist. Absolutely ridiculous. Magic, I repeated, not really believing what I was hearing. What's your basis for saying that? Faith, he replied quickly. Faith in magic? I thought to myself, I can't believe what I'm hearing. If faith in magic is the best materialists have to offer, then I don't have enough faith to be a materialist. No, if faith in magic is the best that this one kid that's an idiot has to offer, don't follow his line of reasoning. In retrospect, it seemed to me that this professor, wait, no, okay, so the professor made it clear, never mind, so it's not the student, sorry, it's not the Christian student, it's that hoity-toity professor. Wow. So again, it plays even more into this idea that the intellectual elite are just a bunch of blowhards that have nothing substantial to substantiate their beliefs. In retrospect, it seems that the professor had a brief moment of complete candor. Oh gosh, yep, you got him, Norm. You asked the right question, and he just blurted out something he was supposed to keep secret for us among the secret order of the atheist materialist. He blew it. Oh man. Let's find out who this guy is so we can remove his materialism card. Because I'm sure they're gonna confuse materialism and materialist. Just wait. He couldn't he knew he couldn't answer the overwhelming evidence in support of the second law, so he admitted that his position had no basis in evidence or good reason. In doing so, he provided another example of the will refusing to believe what the mind knows to be true, and that's how atheist view is based on sheer faith. There it is. I just called it, didn't I? I mean, not just now, but, some minutes ago, this idea that they're going to just come back to this idea of atheists don't want to believe because we have some issue, not because of evidence. So it's this really reassuring concept to Christians that are questioning their faith and are feeling a bit, not outclassed, but that, it seems like there's a lot of science and math and stuff in favor of the atheist position. And for us, it just does seem like there's a lot of faith. So this idea of dragging the atheist down to saying, nah, they have faith too. And I don't even have enough faith to be an atheist. Our faith is more realistic and smart, and their faith is just total duty poo-poo. This is the type of argument that we're at. It amazes me that the two well-respected, well-versed in their field adults are making such an immature kind of argument, and I think that Coconut has something to say about that, because she's also frustrated, and I know. Well, the professor was right about one thing: having faith. In fact, he needed a leap of faith to willingly ignore the most established law in all of nature. That's how Arthur Eddington characterized the second law more than 80 years ago, and this is a block quote. The law that entropy increases, the second law of thermodynamics, holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experiments do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. This is the end of the block quote. But again, who cares? Why are you trying to establish that the second law of thermodynamics exists? What are we doing with these pages? Oh, why? How is this getting us closer to Yahweh exists? How? Since I could see that the professor was not really interested in accepting the truth, I didn't ask him any more potentially humiliating questions. Oh, there we go, Norm. You could have humiliated that atheist. I mean, that's all this book seems to be about. This isn't about anything other than trying to make fun of people so we can make our own selves feel better. That's kind of how it's coming off. You're not dumb, or I'm not dumb, you're dumb. It's just like a big nuh-uh. But since we couldn't ignore the power of the second law on our own bodies, we both ordered dessert. Neither of us was willing to deny that we needed to replace the energy we had just used up. A little bit corny. Forced. I like the other one, though. The other joke was good. You didn't like that joke. That's all right. So for the surge, the universe is expanding. Again, how does this get us closer to Yahweh? I don't know. Good scientific theories are those that are able to predict phenomena that have not yet been observed. As we have seen, general relativity predicted an expanding universe. But it wasn't until legendary astronomer Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope more than a decade later, gotta put these glasses back on, that scientists finally confirmed that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding from a single point. Astronomer Vesto Melvin Slipher was hot on the trail of an expanding universe as early as 1913, but it was Hubble who put all the pieces together in the late 1920s. This expanding universe is the second line of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. But again, why are we trying to prove the universe had a beginning? You're supposed to be trying to argue that Yahweh was that beginning. Not that the universe began, but that Yahweh started it. I don't know what... This just seems to be a lot of... This is one of those books that Christians give atheists, saying, there's a lot of science in here. I think you'll really be impressed. This is that type of thing. Yeah, great, we're mentioning science, but it has absolutely nothing to do with anything you're trying to demonstrate. How does an expanding universe prove a beginning? Well, think about it this way. I mean, you guys aren't even in this field of study. You can just cite a couple guys like you already did and move to the next premise, because that's what we're doing, right? We're on premise 1, 2, and 3. Right now we're on premise 2. You don't need to sit here and establish that the universe had a beginning. Nobody's arguing that, and if they were arguing that, they wouldn't come to Geisler and Turek about it. They'd go to a cosmologist. Do you know what I'm saying? So we're sitting here wasting all this time trying to, dazzle us with some scientific concepts? But for what end? For what end? I guess I'll keep reading, but I'm just really not happy with this. All right. So how does an expanding universe prove a beginning? Think about it this way. If we could watch a video recording of the history of the universe in reverse, we would see all the matter of the universe collapse to a point, not the size of a basketball, not the size of a golf ball, not even the size of a pinhead, but mathematically and logically to a point that is actually nothing, i.e. no space, no time, and no matter. In other words, there was once nothing, and then bang, there was something. The entire universe exploded into being. This, of course, is what is commonly called the Big Bang, and I think Coconut is trying to remind us that no, nobody says that it exploded except for Christians trying to misrepresent the concept. I know. It's important to understand that the universe is not expanding into empty space, but space itself is expanding. There was no space before the Big Bang. It's also important to understand that the universe did not... Miss Ma'am. It's also important to understand that the universe did not emerge from existing material, but from nothing. There was no matter before the Big Bang. In fact, chronologically, there was no before the Big Bang because there are no befores without time, and there was no time until the Big Bang. Time, space, and matter came into existence at the Big Bang. Great! Let us get closer to a God. These facts give atheists a lot of trouble, as they did on a rainy night in Georgia of April 1998. How does this give atheists trouble? What? That night, I, Frank, attended a debate in Atlanta on a question, does God exist? William Lane Craig, oh boy, get ready for some fancy word salad. We're talking the $25 salad at a restaurant here, okay? A lot of expensive bells and whistles, but no real substance. William Lane Craig took the affirmative position, and Peter Atkins took the negative position. The debate was highly spirited and even humorous at times, partially due to the moderator, William F. Buckley, Jr. Buckley did not hide his favoritism for Craig's pro-God position. After introducing Craig and his impressive credentials, Buckley began to introduce Atkins by cracking, "On the side of the devil is Dr. Peter Atkins." Hilarious. Ha ha ha. One of Craig's 5 arguments for the existence of God was the cosmological argument, as supported by the Big Bang. Evidence we've been discussing here. He pointed out that the universe, all time, all matter, and all space exploded out of nothing. A fact that Atkins had conceded in his book and later reaffirmed in the debate that night. Since Craig spoke first, he informed the audience how Atkins attempts to explain the universe from an atheistic perspective. Quote, in his book, The Creation Revisited, Dr. Atkins struggles mightily to explain how the universe could come into existence, uncaused out of nothing. But in the end, he finds himself trapped in self-contradiction. He writes, additional quote, now we go back in time to the moment of creation, to when there was no time, and to where there was no space. Ending the book quote. At this time, before time, he imagines a swirling dust of mathematical points which recombine again and again and again, and finally come, by trial and error, to form our space-time universe, and this ends the quote from William Lane Craig. Craig went on to point out that Atkins' position is not a scientific theory, but is actually self-contradictory pop metaphysics. It is pop metaphysics because it's a made-up explanation. There's absolutely no scientific evidence supporting it. And it's self-contradictory because it assumes time and space were there before time and space. Since Craig did not get a chance to dialogue with Dr. Atkins directly on this point, Ravi Zacharias and I stood in the question line near the end of the debate to ask Dr. Atkins about his question. And I keep putting Dr. Atkins, but actually it just says Atkins. Unfortunately, time expired before either of us could ask a question, so we approached Atkins backstage afterwards. Convenient, right? Convenient. So they were there. They were ready to ask the questions. But this conversation, we're just going to have to trust that this happened. Dr. Atkins, Ravi started, you admit that the universe exploded out of nothing, but your explanation for the beginning equivocates on what nothing is. Swirling mathematical points are not nothing, even if they are something. Or even they are something. How do you justify this? Instead of addressing the issue, Atkins verbally succumbed to the second law of thermodynamics. He said, look, gentlemen, I'm very tired. I can't answer any more questions now. In other words, his decrease of energy, proved the second law was at work. Ha! Checkmate, atheists. Atkins literally had nothing to say. Wow. And again, we just have to take his word that this really happened. He really approached him backstage, and really Atkins had nothing to say. I mean, come on. Well, according to the modern cosmological evidence, the universe literally had nothing from which to emerge. Now, I don't know if that's really what it's saying, or if this is some kind of misrepresentation, misunderstanding, or what have you. I don't really want to take the authors at their word, because they haven't really shown that their word is in line with reality. Whether they're lying or just genuinely confused as to what certain atheists say or what atheists believe in general, they haven't shown that they're actually capable of representing this in a way that accurately comes out of atheists' mouths. So this idea that there's nothing from which to emerge, I'm not sure if that's really the case. Now, I'm not a cosmologist, but I've heard a lot of different ideas about like a multiverse, or that there's a large verse and we're like one incarnation of a universe, but there's other pockets of different other verses. So there's this universe, we can just call it universe A, and then another universe, universe B, and these are part of, so we don't know if this is the case. We don't know. Now, I know people aren't necessarily going to like this phrasing, but we don't know what's outside of the universe. We don't have any reason to assume there is or assume there isn't. We should just be open to either possibility. So this idea is saying that, well, there was literally nothing. How do we know that's the case? Did you step outside of the universe and check? So this is such a weird thing for them to say. And again, it doesn't get us any closer to, therefore, Yahweh. It doesn't get us any closer to that. Yet, when it came to giving an atheistic explanation for this, Atkins didn't really begin with nothing but mathematical points and time. Of course, one can't imagine how mere mathematical points and time could actually cause the universe in any way. Nevertheless, we wanted to press the fact that atheists like Atkins must be able to explain how the universe began from absolutely nothing. This is exactly what I mean. This doesn't get us any closer to Yahweh, and this also doesn't get us any closer to what atheists actually say. A lot of atheists like me say, we don't know. Why is he saying they must be able to explain? Why? What is nothing? Aristotle had a good definition. He said nothing is what rocks dream about. The nothing from which the universe emerged is not mathematical points, as Atkins suggested, or positive and negative energy, as Isaac Asimov, who was also an atheist, once wrote. Nothing is literally no thing, what rocks dream about. British author Anthony Kenny honestly described his own predicament as an atheist in the light of evidence for the Big Bang. He wrote, according to the Big Bang theory, the whole matter of the universe began to exist at a particular time in the remote past. A proponent of such a theory, at least if he's an atheist, must believe that the matter of the universe came from nothing and by nothing. Again, this isn't about what you think atheists might believe. This is about what you can demonstrate points to Yahweh. It's like when you ask a flat earther how we know the earth is flat, they try to point out why the round earth isn't round because NASA, fake, CGI, whatever, which is fine, okay, but at best, if we are in agreement, we've come to the conclusion that it's not a sphere. That's it. Or an oblate spheroid. We haven't come to the conclusion that it therefore is flat. So even if this is accurate, which it's not, but even if it was accurate, all we've done is say these big name atheists don't know how to explain how something came from nothing. Fine. That doesn't mean that God did it because Atkins doesn't know how to explain this. That doesn't... How does this get us any closer? Ugh. So we have surge. Now we're in the R. Radiation from the Big Bang. Guys, I don't know if I really want to read this. Because we're not getting any closer. I feel like we're just running around chasing our tail. This does look short, at least. The third line of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. Again, nobody's coming to Geisler and Turek in this book to double check that the universe had a beginning. No one's asking you to prove this, guys. It was discovered by accident in 1965. That's when Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson detected strange radiation in their antenna at Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey. No matter where they turned their antenna, this mysterious radiation remained. They initially thought it might be the result of bird droppings deposited on the antenna by nesting Jersey Shore pigeons, so they had the birds and the droppings removed. But when they got back inside, they found the radiation was still there, and it was still coming from all directions. What Penzias and Wilson had detected turned out to be one of the most incredible discoveries of the last century, one that would win them Nobel Prizes. These two Bell Lab scientists had discovered the afterglow from the Big Bang fireball explosion. So not only are we saying the wrong term, explosion, which implies a fireball, now they're outright saying a fireball. I mean, can we distort? I mean, and this is something they believe happened. They believe that the Big Bang was bang. You know, God said bang. God said, "Let there be light," and bang, it happened. That's their type of idea of the Big Bang. So I don't even know why they're mischaracterizing it in a fireball explosion, because this is what they believe. This is so bizarre. Technically known as the cosmic background radiation, this afterglow is actually light and heat from the initial explosion. The light is no longer visible because its wavelength has been stretched by the expanding universe to wavelengths slightly shorter than those produced by a microwave oven, but the heat can still be detected. As early as 1948, 3 scientists predicted that this radiation would be out there if the Big Bang really did occur. But for some reason, no one attempted to detect it before Penzias and Wilson stumbled upon it by accident nearly 20 years later. When the discovery was confirmed, it laid to rest any lingering suggestion that the universe is an eternal, steady state. Agnostic astronomer Robert Jastrow put it this way, and this is a block quote: "No explanation other than the Big Bang have been found for the fireball radiation. The clincher, which has convinced almost the last doubting Thomas, is that the radiation was discovered by Penzias and Wilson has exactly the patterns of wavelengths expected for the light and heat produced in a great explosion. Supporters of the steady-state theory have tried desperately to find an alternative explanation, but they have failed. At the present time, the Big Bang theory has no competitors." And then this is the end of the quote. Notice how it says no competitors. It doesn't say the Big Bang theory proves God. In effect, the discovery of the fireball radiation burned up any hope in the steady state. But it wasn't the end of the discoveries. More Big Bang evidence would follow. In fact, if cosmology were a football game, believers in the Big Bang would call for a piling on. What is this next discovery? The G is Great Galaxy Seeds. I'm not sure I've heard this one. After finding the predicted expanding universe and radiation afterglow, scientists turned their attention to another prediction that would confirm the Big Bang. If the Big Bang actually occurred, scientists believed that we would see slight variations or ripples in the temperature of the cosmic background radiation that Penzias and Wilson had discovered. Those temperature ripples enabled matter to congregate by gravitational attraction into galaxies. If found, they would comprise the fourth line of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. In 1989, the search for these ripples was intensified when NASA launched the $200 million satellite, aptly called COBE for Cosmic Background Explorer. Now, this is one of those terms that I've only seen, never heard, so I'm just going to say COBE, because I don't know if it's Kobe. Carrying extremely sensitive instruments, COBE was able to see whether these ripples actually existed in the background radiation and how precise they were. When the project leader, astronomer George Smoot, announced COBE's finding in 1992, his shocking characterization was quoted in newspapers all around the world. He said, quote, "If you're religious, it's looking at God. It's like looking at God." End quote. The University of Chicago astrophysicist Michael Turner was no less enthusiastic, claiming, quote, "The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. They have found the holy grail of cosmology." End quote. Cambridge astronomer Stephen Hawking also agreed, calling the findings, quote, "the most important discovery of the century, if not of all time," end quote. What did COBE find to merit such momentous descriptions? COBE not only found the ripples, but scientists were amazed at their precision. The ripples show that the explosion and expansion of the universe was precisely tweaked to cause just enough matter to congregate to allow the galaxy formation, but not enough to cause the universe to collapse back in on itself. Let me guess, they're going to have a Goldilocks analogy? And that's why we know it's finely tuned, intelligent design, right? Any slight variation one way or the other, and none of us would be here to tell about it. In fact, the ripples are so exact, down to 1 part in 100,000, that Smoot called them the, quote, machining marks from a creation of the universe, end quote, and the, quote, fingerprints of the maker, end quote. But these temperature ripples are not just dots on a scientist's graph somewhere. COBE actually took infrared pictures of the ripples. Now keep in mind that these space observations are actually observations of the past because of the long time it takes these distant objects to reach us. So COBE's pictures are actually pictures of the past. That is, the infrared pictures taken by COBE point to the existence of matter from the very early universe that would ultimately form into galaxies and clusters of galaxies. Smoot called these matter seeds of the galaxies as they exist today, and then it gives us a link that we can go check out the pictures. These seeds are the largest structures ever detected, with the biggest extending across 1/3 of the known universe. That's 10 billion light years, or 60 billion trillion, 60 followed by 21 zeros, miles. Now we can see why some scientists were so grandiose in their description of the discovery. Something predicted by the Big Bang was again found, and that something was so big and so precise, it made a big bang with scientists. I mean, man, we are just taking every pun opportunity. I can't hate them for that. Finally, the E, Einstein's theory of general relativity. Why are we putting this here? We already put it in the beginning. The E in surge is for Einstein. His theory of general relativity is the 5th line of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning, and its discovery was the beginning of the end for the idea that the universe is eternal. The theory itself, which has been verified to 5 decimal places, demands an absolute beginning for time, space, and matter. It shows that time, space, and matter are co-relative. That is, they are interdependent. You can't have one without the others. From general relativity, scientists predicted and then found the expanding universe, the radiation afterglow, and the great galaxy seeds that were precisely tweaked to allow the universe to form its present state. Notice the specific wording there. Precisely tweaked, which implies a tweaker. These discoveries to the second law of thermodynamics, or add these discoveries to the second law of thermodynamics, and we have 5 lines of powerful scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. A beginning, we might say, that came in a great surge. That's fine, but we just spent how many pages trying to talk about something that did not need to be talked about? This is page 76. And boy, page 84, what, 8 pages we just spent? But for what? Again, nobody's asking these guys to prove this stuff. This has been established by other people whose jobs actually were dealing with this. God and the astronomers. So the universe had a beginning. What does that mean for the question of God's existence? Finally, right? The man who now sits in Edwin's Hubble chair at the Mount Wilson Observatory has a few things to say about that. His name is Robert Jastrow, an astronomer we've already quoted in this chapter. In addition to serving as the director of Mount Wilson, Jastrow is the founder of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. Obviously, his credentials as a scientist are impeccable. That's why his book, God and the Astronomers, made such an impression on those investigating the implications of the Big Bang, namely those asking the question, does the Big Bang point to God? Jastrow reveals in the opening line of Chapter 1 that he has no religious axe to grind. He writes, quote, full of quotes, "When an astronomer writes about God, his colleagues assume he either is over the hill or going bonkers. In my case, it should be understood from the start that I am an agnostic in religious matters." End quote. In light of Jastrow's personal agnosticism, his theistic quotations are all the more provocative. After explaining some of the Big Bang evidence we've just reviewed, Jastrow writes, quote, "Now we see that the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to a man commence suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time, in a flash of light and energy." End quote. Is that all you wanted to say? One scientist has an opinion? Okay, cool. I don't see why we had to waste 8 pages and nothing. The overwhelming evidence for the Big Bang and its consistency with the biblical account in Genesis led Jastrow to observe and interview. Astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven, by their own methods, that the world began abruptly. Not the world, the universe. I'm just kind of cutting in here, sorry, but the world didn't begin abruptly in an act of creation. Wow, to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and Earth. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work now, I think, as a scientifically proven fact. Cool, but the thing about science is that it's not one scientist's opinion. It's about what you can demonstrate, especially as it's peer-reviewed. So, where's that? By evoking the supernatural, Jastrow echoes the conclusion of the Einstein contemporary Arthur Eddington. As we mentioned earlier, although he found it repugnant, Eddington admitted, quote, "The beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look at this on the frankly supernatural," end quote. Now, why would Jastrow and Eddington admit that there are supernatural forces at work? Why couldn't natural forces have produced the universe? Because these scientists know as well as anyone that natural forces, indeed all of nature, were created at the Big Bang. In other words, the Big Bang was at the beginning point for the entire physical universe, which is fine. I was kind of thinking, is that what they were talking about? That there were some forces outside of our universe that doesn't have to point to a god, just a different set of rules that govern how the universe kind of came together. Time, space, and matter came into existence at that point. There was no natural world or natural law prior to the Big Bang. Since a cause cannot come after its effect, natural forces cannot account for the Big Bang. Therefore, there must be something outside of nature to do the job. That's exactly what supernatural means. The discoverers of the afterglow, Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, were not Bible thumpers either. Both initially believed in a steady-state theory, but due to the mounting evidence, they've since changed their views and acknowledged that facts are consistent with the Bible. Penzias admits, quote, "The steady-state theory turned out to be so ugly that people dismissed it. The easiest way to fit the observations with the least number of parameters was one in which the universe was created out of nothing in an instant and continues to expand," end quote. Where's that quote that shows it's consistent with the Bible? That would have been a better quote, if we're just pulling quotes out and filling up our book. Wilson, who once took a class from Fred Hoyle, the man who popularized the steady-state theory in 1948, said, quote, "I philosophically like the steady state, and clearly I've had to give that up," end quote. Okay, so what? So what? How are we getting closer to Yahweh? This is the part that it just keeps going on and on and on in a direction nobody asked. When science writer Fred Heron asked if the Big Bang evidence is indicative of a creator, Wilson responded, quote, "Certainly there was something that set it all off. Certainly if you are religious, I can't think of a better theory of origin of the universe than to match with Genesis," quote, end quote. George Smoot echoed Wilson's assessment. He said, quote, "There is no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing," end quote. Now, I don't know this guy, I don't know the whole conversation, the context of the conversation, but to say, yeah, they sound similar, that doesn't mean that they're saying it happened the way that is described in Genesis because the person who wrote Genesis was being spoken to by Yahweh, who created the universe and told him how he created it. That's not what this is saying. It's saying, yeah, there's similarities. The Empire strikes back, but fizzles out. What do atheists have to say about this? Well, let's see if they ask anybody. We've already seen the shortcomings of the explanation of Atkins and Isaac Asimov. They started with something rather than literally nothing. Are any other atheistic explanations out there that may be plausible? Not that we've seen. Well, what about just, I don't know? That's fine. That's honest. Atheists have come up with other theories, but all of them have their fatal flaws. Let's take a brief look at a few of them. I don't know if I want to. I feel like this is just going to waste time. And I feel like that's kind of where we keep going, but I want you guys to come to the conclusion yourself. So I will, because I get to skim through this and say, I don't know if this is worth reading, but you guys can't see it, so you can't do the same thing. The cosmic rebound theory. This is the theory that suggests the universe has been expanding and contracting forever. This helps its proponents avoid a definite beginning. But the problems with this theory are numerous, and for those reasons it has fallen out of favor. First and most obviously, there's no evidence for an infinite number of bangs. After all, it's not the Big Bang, 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 bang theory. The universe appears to have exploded once from nothing, not repeatedly from an existing material. I think that's a pretty bad argument. If you take a lump of clay and you create something out of it, and then you crush it down back into a lump and create something new out of it, and crush it down back into a lump and create a third thing, there won't be like a signature of the first two things in the third thing that will make us think, oh yes, this lump of clay was formed into two other things prior to this. So what I'm saying is that if the first thing we create is a cup, and the second thing we create is a statue of a person, and the third thing that we create is like a sculpture that looks like a cat, the cat sculpture is not going to have a signature of the person or the cup. It's just going to look like a cat because it started from the same lump or the same starting position. So I think this is a really bad critique. It's not the Big Bang, bang, bang. Well, how would we know? We can only see where we started off from. Second, there's not enough matter in the universe to pull everything back together. The universe seems poised to continue expanding indefinitely. This was confirmed in 2003 by Charles Bennett of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. After looking at readings from NASA's latest space probe, he said, "The universe will expand forever. It will not turn back on itself and collapse in a great crunch," end quote. And the reason he said that was because people did have this idea. Which is something to bring up if you are talking to Muslims, by the way, because they believe that this will collapse and kind of crunch back down. Something in the Quran about, like, he opens it up like a book and then he'll close it back together, something like that. In fact, astronomers are now finding the universe's expansion speed is actually accelerating, making a collapse even more improbable. Third, if there were enough matter to cause the universe to contract and bang again, cosmic rebound theory contradicts the second law of thermodynamics because the theory falsely assumes that no energy will be lost in each contraction and explosion. A universe banging repeatedly would eventually fizzle out, just as a drop ball eventually fizzles out. So if the universe had been expanding and contracting forever, it would have fizzled out already. Finally, there's no way to have gotten here if the universe had been expanding and contracting forever. An infinite number of Big Bangs is an actual impossibility, which we'll elaborate on in a couple pages. But why? Nobody asked you to. I mean, for real, I don't come to these two theologians for cosmology. You know what I'm saying? Ugh. I wouldn't go talk to them about cosmology any more than I would talk to them about cosmetology. They're theologians. But why are they trying to demonstrate, oh, we know so much about cosmology? Who cares? We're trying to get to the idea that the cosmology has a basis in Yahweh. So where are we going with this? And even if there were a finite number of bangs, the theory cannot explain what banged the first one. There's nothing to bang before the first bang. Imaginary time. Other atheistic attempts at explaining how the universe exploded into being out of nothing are just as flawed. For example, in an effort to avoid absolute beginning of the universe, Stephen Hawking made up a theory that utilizes, quote, imaginary time, end quote. We could have just called it a, quote, imaginary theory, end quote, because Hawking himself admits that his theory is, quote, just a metaphysical proposal, end quote, that cannot explain what happened in real time. Quote, in real time, end quote, he concedes, quote, the universe has a beginning, ... end quote. In fact, according to Hawking, quote, almost everyone now believes in a universe, or the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang, end quote. So by his own admission, Hawking's imaginary theory fizzles when applied to the real world. Imaginary time is just that, purely imaginary. So it's trying to argue that, well, here are some atheist theories as if they're currently believed. How about, oh, somebody thought of this and said no. Uncertainty. With the evidence for the beginning of the universe so strong, some atheists question the first premise of the cosmological argument, the law of causality. Well, hey, we're getting closer, right? This is dangerous ground for atheists who typically pride themselves in being champions of reason and science. As we've pointed out before, the law of causality is the foundation of all science. Science is a search for causes. If you destroy the law of causality, then you destroy science itself, which is fine if you're going to say the universe is the cause or the result. You have to demonstrate what caused it. And that's what we're trying to find. You still have to demonstrate that you think that Yahweh is the most likely. Atheist attempts to cast doubt on the law of causality by citing quantum physics. Well, I didn't do that. Specifically, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. This principle describes our inability to simultaneously predict the location and speed of subatomic particles, i.e. electrons. The atheist contention here is this: if causality at the subatomic realm isn't necessary, then maybe causality for the universe isn't necessary either. Okay. Fortunately for all science, this atheistic attempt to cast doubt on the law of causality fails. Why? Because it confuses causality with predictability. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle does not prove that the movement of electrons is uncaused, only that it describes the inability to predict their location at any given time. Now, has anybody heard this one? I've heard the repeated banging. That one I've heard, the cosmic rebound theory. Haven't heard imaginary time. Haven't heard atheists making this confused suggestion about the uncertainty principle. Okay. So, the mere fact that we can't predict something doesn't mean that it had no cause. In fact, quantum theorists acknowledge that we might not be able to predict the simultaneous speed and location of electrons because our very attempts at observing them are the cause of their unpredictable movements. Like a beekeeper putting his head in a beehive, we must stir them up in order to observe them. Hence, the disturbance may be the case of the scientist looking at his own eyelashes under the microscope. In the end, no atheistic theory adequately refutes either premise of the cosmological argument. The universe had a beginning and therefore needs a cause. Okay, but you still have to demonstrate the cause is Yahweh. That's the thing. I wasn't disagreeing with any of... I don't know any atheist who disagrees with any of this. And the religion of science. Oh boy. Oh boy. So why don't all scientists just accept this conclusion instead of attempting to avoid the facts and their implication with wild and implausible explanations? I mean, does anybody today, because, this book was written in 2004, so maybe this is an argument that just kind of no longer exists, but does anybody today know anybody who doesn't want to believe the universe had a beginning? Jastro's comments are again insightful. Remember, Jastrow is an agnostic. Jastrow observes, block quote, theologians generally are delighted with the proof that the universe had a beginning, but astronomers are curiously upset. Their reactions provide an interesting demonstration of the response to the scientific mind, supposedly a very objective mind, when evidence is uncovered by science itself leads to a conflict with the articles of faith in our profession. It turns out that the scientist behaves in the way the rest of us do when our beliefs are in conflict with the evidence. We become irritated, we pretend that the conflict doesn't exist, or we paper it over with meaningless phrases, end quote. I kind of feel like some of the stuff that the authors keep citing and quoting that's in, that is supposed to be critical of scientists, it's stuff that they can kind of turn and have it be critical about their own writing. I mean, really, I'm having such a hard time with this book. I'm sorry, guys, I keep complaining about it, but it's just, where are we going with all of this? We're not getting us any closer to, this is why I believe God. Alright, I won't say that again for the rest of this, I promise. The phrases have been used by Atkins and Asimov to explain the beginning of the universe, mathematical points, and positive and negative energy, respectively, certainly seem meaningless to us. Indeed, they explain nothing. Yeah, just like this doesn't get us any closer to Yahweh. Regarding Einstein's irritating feelings about general relativity and the expanding universe, Jastrow writes, quote, "This is curiously emotional language for a discussion of some mathematical formulas. I suppose that the idea of a beginning in time annoyed Einstein because of its theological implications," end quote. Everyone knows that the theists have theological beliefs, but what's often overlooked is that atheistic and pantheistic scientists also have theological beliefs. Well, yeah, of course pantheistic people have theistic belief or theological beliefs. As noted above, Jastrow calls some of these beliefs, quote, "the articles of faith in our profession," end quote, and he asserts that some of these beliefs comprise, quote, "the religion in science," end quote. He writes, block quote, "There is a kind of religion in science. Every effect must have its cause. There is no first cause. This religious faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under the conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid, and as a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. When that happens, the scientist has lost control. If he really examined the implications, he would be traumatized." Wow. Well, I mean, what loaded language. As usual, when faced with trauma, the mind reacts by ignoring implications. In science, this is known as refusing to speculate or trivializing the origin of the world by calling it a Big Bang as if the universe were a firecracker, end quote. I really don't like using the phrase traumatized. I do agree that he's saying, hey, just follow the evidence where it goes. I also like that he's not saying, oh, this has to be religious. So I still don't know where this is. I think that he's just being quoted because he's critical of other people in his profession, which is what Geisler and Turek want to show, that the people in the scientific profession are these big babies that can't get through life without holding on to these pathetic attempts at replacing God. I think that's the only reason they're really quoting him, because again, we're not getting us any closer to Yahweh is the most likely first cause for the universe. Traumatized or not, scientists must come to grips with the implications of the Big Bang evidence. They may not like the evidence or its implications, but that won't change the facts. Since the evidence shows that time, space, and matter were created by the Big Bang, the most probable scientific conclusion was that the universe was caused by something outside of time, space, and matter, i.e. an eternal cause. Now, I don't know why it has to be eternal. I mean, yeah, I guess, for example, it could be eternal, but I don't know why it must be eternal. When scientists stop short of that conclusion by papering it over with, quote, meaningless phrases, end quote, or by, quote, refusing to speculate, end quote, it seems that they are simply refusing to accept the facts and the most reasonable conclusions that come from them. This is a matter of the will, not the mind. The evidence is objective. It's the disbelieving scientists who are not. So again, we're still ending with, haha, they don't want to believe it even though they claim to follow the evidence, haha. Where are we getting closer to God? What if the Big Bang Theory is wrong? Nobody's asking this. Oh boy. So far, we've given solid scientific evidence, surge, for the fact that the universe had a beginning. But suppose scientists wake up one day and find out all their calculations have been wrong. There was no Big Bang. Given the wide scope of evidence by the ability of the theory to correctly predict so much of observable phenomena, a total abandonment of the Big Bang would be extremely unlikely. And it's also true for evolution. This is admitted even by atheists. Victor Stenger, a physicist who teaches at the University of Hawaii, once wrote that, quote, the universe exploded out of nothingness, end quote. Stenger, well, now this is a quote that was pulled out of the middle of a sentence. So I don't know if this is being mischaracterized. Stenger recently acknowledged that the Big Bang is looking more probable all the time. Quote, we have to leave open the possibility that the Big Bang could be wrong, end quote, but said, quote, but every year that goes by, more and more astronomical data comes in. It's more and more consistent with the general Big Bang picture, end quote. Indeed, in 2003, more evidence came forth that the Big Bang is correct. NASA's WMAP satellite, Wilkins Microwave Anisotropy probe, thank you, confirms the finding of the predecessor COBE and returned pictures 35 times sharper than COBE's of the background radiation ripples. In fact, space observations are becoming so supportive of the theistic worldview that George Will muses, quote, soon the American Civil Liberties Union or the People for the American Way or some similar faction of litigious secularism will file suit against NASA, charging that the Hubble Space Telescope unconstitutionally gives comfort to the religiously inclined, end quote. That's one of those quotes that's just thrown in as just to spit in people's faces. Again, Geisler, Turek, who is your target audience? It doesn't seem to be atheists. It's like they take a pot shot anytime they can. Nevertheless, let's play skeptic's advocate for a second. Let's suppose that at some point in the future the Big Bang Theory is deemed wrong. Would that mean the universe is eternal? No, for a number of reasons. Well, that's great. Just because you showed that the universe had a beginning, that doesn't mean you showed that Yahweh exists. First, the second law of thermodynamics, the S in surge, supports the Big Bang, but is not dependent on it. The fact that the universe is running out of usable energy and heading toward disorder is not even up for debate. In Eddington's words, the second law, quote, holds a supreme position among the laws of nature, end quote. It is true even if the Big Bang is not. Second, the same can be said for Einstein's theory of general relativity, the E in surge. This theory, well verified by observation, requires a beginning to space, matter, and time, whether or not it all began with a bang. Third, requires a beginning, whether or not it all began with a bang. I don't think the word bang is what people take contention with in this scenario that they're arguing that doesn't exist or doesn't exist any longer. Third, there's also scientific evidence from geology that the universe had a beginning. As many of us learned in high school chemistry, radioactive elements decay over time into other elements. For example, radioactive uranium eventually turns into lead. This means that if all the uranium atoms were infinitely old, they would all be lead by now, but they're not. So, the Earth cannot be infinitely old. Who's arguing that the Earth is infinitely old? Who's arguing this? I mean, even if we grant the concept that, for the sake of argument, we say, yeah, the universe is infinitely old, that doesn't mean the Earth is infinitely old. They don't even know what they're saying sometimes. Finally, there's a philosophical line of evidence for the beginning of the universe. This line of evidence is so rationally inescapable that some consider it the strongest argument of all. It's called the kalam, from the Arabic word eternal, cosmological argument, and it goes like this. Number 1, an infinite number of days has no end. Number 2, but today is the end day of history, history being a collection of all days. Number 3, therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today, i.e., time had a beginning. To grasp this argument, see the timeline below, marked in segments of days, figure 3.1. The further left you go, the further back in history you go. Now assume for a moment that the line extends to the left indefinitely, so you can't see where it begins. But as you look to the right, you can see the end of the line because the last segment of the line represents today. Tomorrow isn't here yet, but when it gets here, we'll add one more segment, i.e. a day, to the end of the line. So it's just described exactly as you see figure 3.1. It's just a long line extending with an arrow pointed to the left. It says distant history, and then there's hash marks, previous days, yesterday, and today. The rightmost is a dot. Now, here's how this proves that time had a beginning. Since the line certainly ends on the right, the timeline cannot be infinite because something that is infinite has no end. Moreover, you can't add anything to something that is infinite, but tomorrow we will add another day to our timeline, so our timeline is undeniably finite. I mean, if you say so, I just don't see how this gets us closer to Yahweh. Let's consider this argument from a different angle. No! No one's asking you to prove this. Come on, guys. If there were an infinite number of days before today, then today would never have arrived, but here we are. So we must only have a finite number of days before today. In other words, even though we may not be able to see, as we look to the left where the line begins, we know it had to begin at some point because only a finite amount of time could have passed for today to arrive. You can't traverse the infinite number of days. Thus, time must have had a beginning. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but as I understand, there's some different concepts for infinity, and there's one that's like a mathematical concept, and there's one that's like a real world concept. If you guys know more about that, let me know, but it just seems like this whole thing seems like a red herring, honestly. Some may say infinite numbers can exist, so why can't infinite days? Because there's a difference between abstract finite infinite series and a concrete one. Okay. I feel like it's kind of funny just as I'm saying this stuff. It's like in the next sentence, the next two sentences it shows up. I think this really shows just how many times these arguments have recycled. How many times I've heard them. Like, I can predict what's coming up. So it's yeah, I don't know. There was a person who was trying to claim that I was mischaracterizing this type of Christian, saying that I was generalizing it to all type of Christians, and how do we know that you were Christian? This is how we know. And we're just talking about this type of Christian specifically. So there's a difference between abstract infinite series and a concrete one. One is purely theoretical, the other is actual. Mathematically, we can conceive of an infinite number of days, but actually we could never count or live for an infinite number of days. You can conceive of an infinite number of mathematical points between two bookends on a shelf, but you cannot fit an infinite number of books between them. That's the difference between the abstract and concrete. Numbers are abstract, days are concrete. By the way, this amplifies our answer above as to why there could not have been an infinite number of bangs in the cosmological history of the universe. An infinite number of actual events is impossible. Well, I don't think they mean infinite when they, you know what I mean? I think it's more like it goes back forever or as far back as we can consider. What we are saying here is that the universe, Big Bang or not, had a beginning. That is, the cosmological argument is true because both premises of the argument are true. Everything that has a cause, everything that comes to be has a cause. The universe came to be. Since the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The beginner, by the way, capital B. Who made God? Not asking this question. In light of all the evidence for the beginning of the space-time universe, the beginner must be outside of the space-time universe. And so with this thing here where they're saying, who made God? I do wonder if we're going to go down the route of some atheists ask this, but this is why we have a first cause or like an unmoved mover, if we're going to see this phrase. Or what else could they pull up? There's like ideas of if it's outside of the universe, then it doesn't have to follow the rules of the universe. Within the universe, there's X rule, but since God is outside of the universe, God doesn't have to follow X rule. That's my guess, what they're gonna say. When God is suggested as the beginner, atheists are quick to ask the age-old question, then who made God? If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause too. Now, I don't argue this because I know the Christian theology, which is that God always was, he is, and he is to come, that he is the great I am. So this is why I know not to argue this, because they don't believe that God came from somewhere. They believe he's just always existed. As we've seen, the law of causality is the very foundation of science. Science has search for causes, and that search is based on our consistent observation that everything that has a beginning has a cause. Now this phrase, like I mentioned, I actually mentioned it earlier in this chapter, didn't I? That they had to add this section, has a beginning, because they already believe God did not have a beginning, therefore he doesn't follow this line of reasoning whatsoever, which is why I hate this type of argument. This type of argument doesn't rely on what we can demonstrate to be true, it just relies on how do we play word games in a way where we define God into existence. And I bet they're going to be critical of that, but then not actually explain how they're not defining God into existence. So, let's see. In fact, the question, who made God, points out how seriously we take the law of causality. It's taken for granted that virtually everything needs a cause. So then, why doesn't God need a cause? Because the atheist contention misunderstands the law of causality. The law of causality does not say everything needs a cause. It says that everything that comes to be needs a cause. God did not come to be. No one made God. He is unmade. As an eternal being, God did not have a beginning, so he didn't need a cause. Well, wait, the atheist will protest. If you have an eternal God, then I can have an eternal universe. After all, if the universe is eternal, then it did not have a cause. Well, yes, it logically is possible that the universe is eternal and therefore didn't have a cause. In fact, it is only one of two possibilities. Either the universe or something outside of the universe is eternal. Since something undeniably exists today, then something must have always existed. We have only the two choices, the universe or something that caused the universe. The problem for the atheist is that while it's logically possible the universe is eternal, it doesn't seem to be actually possible. You guys even are using my argument against you to use it against atheists? So you being the authors, you guys do see the problem with using a logical argument that doesn't reflect in reality. How you could word something into existence, or you could word something in a way it sounds true, but you didn't actually demonstrate it sounds true. So this is, they keep doing this. They keep having these criticisms against atheists or skeptics. They kind of use this term interchangeably. They keep claiming X about them, but it's really like, what's the phrase? When you point a finger at somebody else, you have three fingers pointing back at you. It's like that. Everything they're saying, it's about them. I don't think they realize this. For all the scientific and philosophical evidence, surge, radioactive decay, and the Kalam cosmological argument tells us the universe cannot be eternal. So by ruling out one of these two options, we are left with only the other option. Something outside the universe is eternal. When you get right down to it, there's only two possibilities for anything that exists. Either one, it's always existed and is therefore uncaused, or two, it had a beginning and was caused by something else. It can't be self-caused because it would have to exist already in order to cause anything. According to the overwhelming evidence, the universe had a beginning, so it must be caused by something else, by something outside of itself. Notice that this conclusion is consistent with theistic religions, but it's not based on those religions. It's based on good reason and evidence, which is fine. It can seem similar, but that doesn't mean we can jump to that conclusion. So what is this first cause like? One might think you need to rely on a Bible or some other so-called religious revelation to answer that question, but again, we don't need anyone's scripture to figure that out. Einstein was right when he said, quote, "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind," end quote. Religion can be informed and confirmed by science, as it is by the cosmological argument. Namely, we can discover some characteristics on the first cause just from the evidence that we've discussed in this chapter. From that evidence alone, we know the first cause must be, number one, self-existent, timeless, non-spatial, and immaterial. Since the first cause created time, space, matter, and the first cause must be outside of time, space, and matter. In other words, he is without limits or infinite. Notice they just said he is without limits or infinite. I also don't like this concept because just because it doesn't meet our universal concept of time and space, that doesn't mean that it's without time and space. It's just time and space in a different instance. So it's kind of like if you have a game, like I have one of those simulation games, it's Skyline 2. I can watch the time pass very quickly, and some of my people in my city, they live, they die, there's births, there's deaths, and this can all happen in a much shorter time than a human lifespan. And the amount of time it takes to erect a building in this game is not only shorter than it would take to erect a real building in my real time. So it could take, if I speed it up, it'll take, a minute or two. But even comparing relative time, it's faster in the game than it would be in my real world time. So what I mean by this is I have a game that is a simulation, and it has its own rules that don't apply to me. There are rules that don't exist in the game. There are rules that only exist in the game. In the real world, my real world, there are ways that I can kind of circumvent some of the things that the game doesn't allow me to do. So it might seem like I have magical powers if one of my citizens in my game could somehow gain the ability to communicate with me. It might seem like I have some kind of magical powers. And because I'm so much older than anybody in this game could possibly fathom to be, it might seem like I'm an infinite being and that I have this ability to create, especially create things out of seemingly nothing. I can just point and say I want this building here, and the building is so. The people don't even have their own free will to the extent that I can control them and make them live in certain places and do certain jobs. So from the perspective of the citizens in my game, I would be this outside, infinite, all-powerful kind of thing. But in my own instance of time, I have a very finite life. I have a beginning and I will have an ending. That doesn't mean that I couldn't create the game. It doesn't mean I couldn't create the city. It doesn't mean the game wasn't created by a finite human. It just means that we're on two different timelines. We have two different instances of existence. We have two different sets of laws of physics, for example. So this is what I don't like about this argument, is that it's assumed that just because it's not in our universe, it must be super magical and have like no rules of its own. Like there's no laws of physics for God to follow. There's no timeline that he has a birth and a death. It's like, oh, well, it's not in the universe, so nothing can affect God in the same way. And that's just such a bad argument. Where are we getting this assumption? Especially when we have an example, just like I gave, of an outside being creating something, a separate universe, a separate world that is smaller than itself, it's smaller than its universe, I mean, for all we know, we're a sim game for some other entity. That doesn't mean the entity is eternal. It's on a different timeline than we are. So I just really don't like this argument at all. So they say we know the first cause must be. No, you're assuming it must be. And you even added a he. You smuggled this in here in this, where do we see in all of the rest of this chapter that the first cause is male? It's not only a being, it is a male being. Where do we even get that? But no, we know this. It must be this. It doesn't must be this. Why are we saying it must be this? It is unimaginably powerful to create the entire universe out of nothing. Again, my citizens would consider me unimaginably powerful to create entire buildings out of nothing, right? Supremely intelligent to design the universe with such incredible precision. Again, how do I know where to put all of the buildings? Personal, in order to choose to convert a state of nothingness into time and space, material. Personal, in order to choose to convert a state of nothingness into the time-space material universe. An impersonal force has no ability to make choices. Okay? I haven't heard them describe personal this way. I've heard personal like personal God, that every time I say a prayer to God, I call out to God, he hears me personally. So this idea of personal, I guess we're saying it is anthropomorphized. It does have a personality. Maybe that's what we're saying. But again, how do we know we're choosing to convert a state of nothingness? How do we know that? Right? If I leave my game on and my cat steps on the keyboard, it can create something. If there's an earthquake and my cup or something falls over, hits the keyboard, it can create something. There was no choice there. So we're making a lot of assumptions here. And I'm not saying it can't be this. I'm just saying you have not at all demonstrated that it is this, that we know it must be this. These characteristics of the first cause are exactly the characteristics theists ascribe to God. I wonder why. If we know it must be, and we also know that you're already religious and you already believe in a God, could we possibly be filling in these criteria based off of that belief? Because I just explained how it doesn't have to follow this at all. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying it doesn't have to. I don't know where they get this idea. Again, these characteristics are not based on someone's religion or subjective experience. They are drawn from the scientific evidence we've just reviewed. Prove it. Show the connection. And this is where I was worried that they would sit here and describe a bunch of stuff nobody's asking them to describe, to say, look, science, 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 science. And then they're going to make a jump to God. So we have all of this evidence here, boop, jump to God, but they're not explaining how they're connected. They're not explaining how we know it must be unimaginably powerful, how it must be able to choose, and that it did choose. We're not seeing any of this. That it's supremely intelligent. We're not seeing any of this. It has to be, I think the word sufficient was a good one, sufficiently intelligent. Just because somebody made the game doesn't mean they're supremely intelligent. I'm not supremely intelligent just because I can interact with my citizens. But they might see me as supremely intelligent. I'm not. And I think in the same way, if there was something, a being, that created the universe, to us it would seem supremely intelligent, or we would hope it is. But, for all we know, it could just be a kid with a My First Coding book. These are drawn from the scientific evidence we've just reviewed, citation needed, and they help us see a critically important section of the box top in this puzzle that we call life. Conclusion: if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Years ago, Norm, debated an atheist at the University of Miami on the question, does God exist? I'm just trying to scan to see if they actually explain a time or an atheist. It's just an atheist. Why aren't we saying who they are? You said who Dr. Atkins was. After I presented much of the evidence we reviewed here, I had the opportunity to ask my opponent some questions. Here's what I asked him. Quote, "Sir, I have some questions for you. First, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all?" I then proceeded to ask a few more questions, thinking he would answer them in sequence. Now, usually when you debate someone, you're trying to persuade the audience. You don't expect your opponent to admit that he's wrong. He's got too much invested in his position, and most debaters have too much ego to admit an error. Again, this just applies to you too, Norm. But this guy was different. He surprised me when he said, "Regarding the first question, that's a good question. That's a really good question." And without any other comment, he went on to answer my second question. After hearing the evidence for the existence of God, this debater was left questioning his own beliefs. He even attended a follow-up meeting and expressed that he had doubts about atheism. His faith in atheism was waning. Indeed. Just that indeed, that's just the whole sentence. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Is a question that we all have to answer. You know, I've never asked that question as a Christian or as an atheist. I remember I was talking to my brother about something, and it was about people. And one of the things he said is, you know, you just have to accept it is the case. If you ask yourself why and chase the why, you'll drive yourself crazy. Now, of course, for me, this is a bit frustrating because, you know, I'm working on finishing up my degree in psychology. And so for me, the why is really important. But he's definitely right in this idea that you cannot just pursue the why for these people in passing, for these people that you'll never know. There's a benefit, of course, to studying psychology. Of course, there's that benefit to know why these things happen and into which groups they happen, right? There's that benefit. But for people that are in passing, for people that you'll never know, you're never going to get a chance to interview them, you're never going to know why, there's no point in this pondering. It'll just drive you crazy. This is the reason I've never asked myself this question, because I don't care why there's something rather than nothing. There is. We should care about how, but why? It might be a question that we just can't answer. I think the how is a little bit easier for us to out of the two concepts, right? The how is something that has a potential answer. The why is something that potentially doesn't have an answer. I mean, even if there is a God, the why just might be, I got bored. You know what I mean? It might not be a satisfying answer, even if we have an answer. So I don't think the why is important. And I notice too, especially when I'm trying to teach my students, if we get too far off on a tangent, it makes it really difficult for them to kind of follow along. And I've had a lot of different, discussions with people, and we can't get pulled off of the path. We have to go from A to B, from B to C. And I feel like what we're doing in this book especially is they're telling us we're going to go from A to B, but then we go from A to the forest, and we get lost. And then by the time we wander back to the path, we've gone maybe halfway there, maybe not, and we can see that we still haven't met B. And so then the authors are telling us, we'll discuss B in the next chapter. And so now we're at a new starting point A.1, and we have to go to B. And instead of going to B, they promise us we're going to get to B, and then instead they take us on another walk into the forest that nobody asked for. And that's, I guess I lied. I guess I said that I wouldn't complain about it, but here we are again. But this is the reason we're not getting any closer. We're just reading. What are we reading for? Why did the authors write this book? I wonder if I'll ever find that answer by the end of the book. Why did they get there? Why did they write this, right? And in the light of the evidence, we're only left with two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing. Why not just something is? How did this happen? I think when we start combine or forcing us to choose this dichotomy, right? I think this opens up a line of argumentation that doesn't need to be opened, because the real question is, how did this happen? The real question isn't for us to try to make guesses about the nature of the how before we even get closer to seeing the how. You know what I mean? Which view is more reasonable? Nothing created something? No. Well, that's not that. Whoa, wait a minute. You said we're left with two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing. And now you're saying nothing created something. What about a non-person? What about just, I don't know, matter interacting? Just as it does, right? Matter can't be created or destroyed. Now, it seems to have been sparked in the Big Bang, but maybe it has its seeds out in the cosmos, I guess is what people call it. So how do we know that this matter doesn't exist? Matter exists in my existence, and matter exists in my citizen's existence. So maybe matter is one of those things that just exists, right? We can see how they're similar, right? It exists here and it exists in the game. So maybe matter is something like that. So we're not saying that nothing created something just because we're saying no one created something. That, again, that's a jump. So we have to really be careful of this, because this is how these apologists, these type of apologists, I'm not saying everybody does this, but these types of apologists, they like to make these jumps, and they're not supported. Even Julie Andrews knew the answer when she's saying, quote, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could," end quote. And if you can't believe that nothing caused something, then you don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and that part is in italics. The most reasonable view is God. Then we just jump into that. Robert Jastrow suggested that when he ended his book, God and the Astronomers, with this classic line, quote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries," end quote. I also want to point out, they didn't say the most reasonable view is a God. They didn't say the most reasonable view is a creator deity. It's capital G God, like the way Christians write it. So we're jumping. We've made a jump, and then we made another jump. And that's it. That's it. That is our ending. That is the ending to the chapter. That's it. That's it. Oh, we wasted so much time going down this, oh, we got to prove the universe had a beginning, because, again, nobody comes to Norm and Frank for this. Just so we could just throw in at the end, well, see, it must be God. How? How did we get here? They tried to be so careful, laying out all these different specifics about the SURGE acronym and everything, and here's, the Hubble telescope, and then there's the original CMB, this observational tool, but then there's this follow-up one, and all this other stuff, right? And they made sure to be so specific about this. And then anytime they talk about theology or about actual criticisms of atheism or of Christianity, it just seems to be so hokey, cobbled together with nothing. And it seems like they're trying to almost piggyback off of the previous writing they've done. Like, look, we went through and established all of this writing, or all of this evidence before. We've established this information about the universe before. Just assume that we're going to be as accurate with all of this. And since we already laid it out, well, you can just assume that everything's okay. And I think that's the part that we're just going to have to stop at. I feel like this is... hopefully you guys can understand my frustration. We read through all of this that nobody asked for. And when we get to the end part that finally attempts to address what we did ask for, it is not at all presented with the same rigor, the same sources, the same step-by-step kind of ideas, even the same, well, some people might argue this, and here's what we would say against it. And other people might argue this, and here's what we would say against it. They're not providing any of that. They're just kind of hoping all the work they did before Well, that supports the conclusion. And again, if this was something a student presented to me, I would just mark them down for the conclusion because the conclusion was not supported by the paper. With that being said, please comment in the comment section below. The comment section is what makes this worth it. It really does. In the details section below, there's some different ways to contact me, including Patreon, if you guys want to donate to what I do. And you can also do, I guess, what do they have? The super thanks or something like that. It's a type of one-time donation. If you do the Patreon route for as little as $1 a month, you can get some exclusive pics and posts, as well as a monthly live stream for just patrons. So we have a good time with that too. And that's all I got for you guys. I hope this was enjoyable because it certainly was painful on my end. As always, thanks for listening.